All right, this is another episode of Observe This. My guest is someone whose writing you've probably seen across all of the places that he's written at. Kenny Herzog, what is going on?
Nothing much, Garrett. I am coming to you from my basement, sitting cross-legged with my laptop on a stack of old high school yearbooks because my wife is working upstairs and I don't have a proper office. Doing well.
That's how we have to do it these days. So Let's kick off the intro music. We'll come back and we'll get into my interview with Kenny.
Observe this, brother.
Hey, so I usually ask people when they come on this show, do you remember when Hulk Hogan went on the war, what was it called? World War III pay-per-view or whatever. And he had what supposedly was an Observer newsletter in his hand. But I think I've talked to Dave about this. Dave thinks it was actually a Pro Wrestling Torch issue. And he on the whole thing about Observe This and, dirt sheets are bad. Do you remember this when this happened?
So you're saying this was when Hogan was in WCW?
1995 or something.
Okay. Yeah. I had, like all wrestling fans, I had my little gap periods.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say 95 was a year where I was relatively tuned out because, as has been discussed in wrestling lore, WWF was sort of creatively ebbing. And, WCW was barely ascendant, really. I mean, it was happening. But, and I was, an upperclassman in high school and like doing crazy high school things. So no, the short answer is no.
What's funny is similarly, my relationship with pro wrestling, I would have been a freshman in college around that time. And, I wasn't watching as closely as I had when I was in high school. And so I don't remember watching that pay-per-view. I probably didn't watch it, but everyone quotes that line to me. And so just watching it back is really hilarious. Like if you go back and watch that pay-per-view when Hogan comes out, it's Hogan, Sting, and Savage. And supposedly Dave had reported that Savage had an injury with his arm, but Savage was going to win this battle royal. And so Hogan just really went offensive at dirt sheet writers or dirt rags or whatever he called them. And everything Dave wrote was 100% true. And Hogan was trying to say that, you cannot believe these guys. So it was just so funny in hindsight. But that's the reason for the title of this show, was that moment on the pay-per-view. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than I usually do it. Because when I bring on folks who I consider, writers or content creators, I kind of like to go through the history of how you became a wrestling fan and sort of that. But you were at a very important show the other day. So I want to start there and then we'll go backwards, because you were at AEW's Grand Slam at Arthur Ashe Stadium. I saw your tweets. I was following what you were viewing and how you fully expected the experience to park your car and all that to be a pretty bad thing. But it seemed like it was not that bad.
Well, no. I just sort of put a pin in that because it's like, that's the sort of thing you look back on 5 years later and see you were just tweeting into the void about like parking. And it's to me, it's even more egregious than looking back and seeing that you had racist tweets. It's just like, because it's so mundane and dumb, but it was an absolute logistical boondoggle, I think, for everyone who commuted to the show.
Right.
But the show itself, as a self-contained thing, definitely delivered. So any moment where I wasn't in my seat enjoying the show was unpleasant. But while in the seat, which was all that was within AEW's control, I had a very good time. And as you can see, Mets fan here. So I at least had the luxury of knowing really my way around the complex, which for those who don't know, in Flushing, Queens, you've got Citi Field, and then basically across the street a half mile away, you got Billie Jean King Tennis Complex with Arthur Ashe Stadium, Louis Armstrong Stadium. So I've been navigating my way on foot or behind the wheel around those body shops and stuff my whole life,
So explain to people why that building was such a great, or I wasn't there, so you can tell me if it was a great experience for pro wrestling, but why is it so historic that AEW ran at this stadium, and why was it such a big deal?
Well, you know, I think it was. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, for me personally, it was a sentimental thing because when I was young, I originally lived not far from there, and then moved out to Long Island, but still was ultimately not not far from there. And a lot of my memories, you know, are there in that area around Flushing and Citi Field, and it was just surreal to come back home in that way and see a wrestling show where my affinity for all of that started. So I don't know if that's how it felt for other people in the building. It also felt a little bit like in the spirit of AEW, like it was a sort of insurgency for it to be happening in this hallowed place where the U.S. Open and sort of proper tennis culture, coalesces once a year, because it is a more it is a less, how do you put it? It's a less refined thing to have this pro wrestling show happening on these sacred grounds of tennis lore. So yeah, and it just felt epic. And the show was so incredibly well produced under the circumstances of being in this big, open air arena when the weather was kind of teetering and could have gone either way as far as closing the roof. So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but it felt symbolic to me personally. I just don't know if that translated to everyone across the nation.
What is interesting to me, a lot of pro wrestling fans watch other sports. They're very passionate about other things, but some pro wrestling fans, they really focus on pro wrestling. And so when I heard that they're running this building, I was like, wow, the ultimate gentlewoman sport of tennis.
Right.
How dare they allow pro wrestling to be in this, in this building? And so I thought it was a very intriguing idea. And if I hadn't gone to All Out in Chicago, which I'm not saying that I'm not happy that I did, because that was an amazing show, but this was kind of one of them where it's like, wow, I would love to see, I would love to go to this building to watch wrestling. And it seems like they may do it again. So I'll probably have other opportunities. Like maybe if there's a pay-per-view instead of a TV show, probably be easier for me to get there. But yeah, that was my intrigue. It was like, man, from a sports perspective, like this is a very famous place to watch tennis.
Yeah.
And then now you have pro wrestling in it, and pro wrestling's never been there from what I understand. So that I just thought there was such an interesting call by Tony Khan to actually put a wrestling show in that building.
Yeah, and I think it's a very intentional thing too, to say, hey, this used to be the way WWE made its mark in the culture by making history in venues that were known, for gatherings of the major four professional sports, WrestleMania 3 and the Silverdome and so on. So I think this was their planting that particular flag, for a new era.
So let's talk about that show. Now, as of this recording, Rampage is tonight. You got to see everything that's going to be on Rampage. I don't want to spoil it for folks, so we won't talk about what's going to happen on Rampage. So we'll just focus strictly on Dynamite.
I left before Rampage anyway, so I wouldn't have
there you go.
Another boondoggle getting back home. So
yeah, because those of you who had stuff to do in the morning, I could see how sticking around for the whole 5 hours would have been tough. Okay, so you've been to a lot of wrestling shows. You've covered a lot of big wrestling shows. How does Dynamite's Grand Slam stack up? Because essentially what it was a pay-per-view for TV. But just from the like how important it felt, the wrestling, you open up with a fantastic match, which is generally never done on TV, to get a 30-minute draw with your two best guys going. But like from the perspective of other wrestling events, you've been to other TV shows or other TV tapings, other pay-per-views. Like, how does it rank in comparison to some of the shows that you've been to?
Yeah, I was thinking while I was there about how I had been at the Raw 25th anniversary show at the Manhattan Center, which by design was more intimate and more fan servicey. So it's a little bit apples and oranges, but just in terms of that big show feel, or being at a sort of milestone event. But I was also thinking, gosh, I've been to so many WWE live events, televised or house shows, and let's put aside sort of indie stuff. And I have to say, I was much more impressed than I expected to be with how smooth and professional everything was. And I should know this because before Dynamite launched, I did a big story about it for vulture.com and spoke with people that were going to be working behind the scenes in production and what their expectations for it were, and to some degree how they were going to be just testing things out in real time. But it's a pretty it actually seems more slick and well-oiled in person than it even, I think, comes across on TV, because on TV it still doesn't come across quite as epic as Raw does, from just the way that the cameras capture the atmosphere for Raw or for SmackDown. So that's something I would say. I would say the show, but the funny thing is the card itself didn't feel as epic for the circumstances. I don't, it was a heady thing, because on the one hand, it did feel like this very grand sort of circumstance, but the show in a way had a small, kind of understated quality to it. It was a very straightforward, wrestling card with a handful of reminded me of when I would go see punk shows when I was a kid, and every band on it would be the band you were looking forward to, and it wasn't this sort of staggered, tiered thing, but it wasn't as if I saw every superstar that I necessarily thought I was going to see, or saw everyone in action, or even that it was that democratized a card. There weren't a lot of women on it. There weren't a lot of performers of color, let's say, on the card, but there's a lot of like white dudes going at it. Okay, fine, but that's what I'm trying to say, is that it was a very kind of like traditional wrestling show in between the margins.
Yeah. So what is I think we're both, you might be a year or two younger than me. We're both in our 40s. We grew up watching pro wrestling as kids. What is your relationship to pro wrestling as you get older, in how you view it, in how, with more knowledge of information and of how things go on, maybe politically, do you find yourself to be as big of a fan as you were as a kid, or have things, because you know so much, has that shifted your mentality in what you get out of being a fan of pro wrestling?
Well, I don't know how you feel about this. I imagine you have feelings about it, but I would say that I have not become more cynical or feel like I'm at any sort of more removed from it. I almost feel badly that I think there's a younger generation of fans, particularly once you get into your late teens and early 20s now, who have this kind of weird, very kind of proximate relationship to the product that I think is a hindrance to just getting, lost in the escapism of it all. That's my hunch. I just think, being like 19 years old and a wrestling fan and already having these like meta conversations about being Marcus and Smarks and what's going on in the back and who's making, and why certain people are getting let go and what Nick Khan is doing, or it feels sort of like a little joyless for me. So I know when I was that age, watching the Attitude Era in college, we definitely were following like the ratings wars between Raw and Nitro, but we didn't want to go that much deeper. And now, to your point, I have a little like insight, but I also try to keep, I've interviewed a lot of these guys, but I don't really I just sort of let it be this thing that exists in a bubble, because then I like to step back out and just still appreciate them from that distance and as a fan. And I try not to get too wrapped up in my relationship to it as someone who covers it,
Now the world, because of presidential politics, because of a pandemic, and because of, a lot of the racial inequalities that are in our faces again, thankfully, that, we have to be very aware of those things in the world to sort of exist in the world. Now, how does that mentality, because I know you are a very thoughtful person, how does that change your perspective? Because you just mentioned, you said, Dynamite, maybe there wasn't a lot of women working on this show. The people of color were few and far between. Like, when you watch wrestling today, are you thinking about all of those things that sort of color our world in what we're going through on a daily basis?
I am, and I think it. I think it alienates me a little bit from sort of the mainstream wrestling observer. Look, I don't have any sort of sense that anyone's paying any more attention to what I have to say than they are. And I had, a nice little podcast I was doing for MLW Radio Network this time last year. I had to put it indefinitely on ice because of just some other stuff that's going on. But that was becoming a very politicized podcast. And I was doing things like having an epidemiologist on to talk about the ethics of producing wrestling shows in the pandemic. And I was, talking to Joe Koff, CEO of Ring of Honor, about their plans for, returning and, in front of live audiences and having protocols, for the return of their TV tapings. And I didn't get the sense that was something people wanted to hear or think about. I definitely know I got feedback from editors of mine at major outlets who I respect and love, the outlets and the editors, who just were very candid that we have gotten very clear feedback that people, wrestling fans writ large, just don't want to they just want to separate those things. And to me, they're inseparable. And part of what is so great about wrestling and looking at wrestling historically and analytically is it's always been inseparable from what's going on in the culture. And that's why books have been written. And that's why, so to me, it's weird to think that they aren't on the same Venn diagram and that we can't have these sort of comfortable, uncomfortable conversations. And I think it's good to push. I think it's good to say, hey, Tony Khan's a big wrestling fan with a lot of money and is living, and we're all living through his wet dream of starting this big promotion. But hey, also, Tony, what about the fact that, yes, you want to make sure safety is the priority for the fans, but it was easy to start having fans and, back in Daly's place early in Florida, because Florida has generally more lax regulations around what constitutes essential entertainment in a pandemic. I think it's okay to, and I think Tony and other executives would agree, it's okay to have those conversations.
Yeah, we actually are going a little bit deeper earlier in the show than I expected, but this is why I wanted to talk to you, because what you've basically said, which is a lot of wrestling fans don't really want to focus on this kind of stuff, because then it just kind of it makes them think about things like, maybe I shouldn't be watching or whatever, whatever they think. But because you also cover, you write, you don't only write about wrestling, you write about a bunch of other things. Now, internet culture, which, when you and I are growing up, we don't have to deal with this. We're reading newspapers and reading books, but now everything is internet. So when it comes to some of the things that you're talking about, what can happen on the internet is, especially on Twitter, things kind of become a pile-on, right? Like, if it's about Tony Khan and, running at Daly's place, the AEW fans would say, well, it's outdoors, and we've learned that being outdoors is much safer than being indoors. And then the people who don't like that would say, well, I saw, a bunch of people without wearing masks. It was underneath their nose. And so you have this sort of back and forth volley. You've been writing on the internet for a very long time. What do you think about internet culture today when it comes to wrestling? Because you can very quickly, I think, be put off by who you believe the fan base is based on what's happening on Twitter. When I sort of look at it and I go, okay, that is a small minority of the fan base, but it's also because these people are empowered with their tweets. They just want to go viral and they want people to follow them. And so there's a game mechanism to it as well. But, you know, you have so much knowledge about this. I'm kind of just interested in your thoughts on how, you know, internet and pro wrestling and all that stuff kind of mixed together.
Well, I appreciate being given the benefit of the doubt of having any sort of, you know, reservoir of insight into stuff. But and I appreciate everything you're putting very eloquently, and it raises so many interesting questions, maybe more than answers. You know, I know that when I started writing primarily for the internet, because when I started in journalism, I was primarily writing in print.
Sure.
And there was a sea change, you know, 7 or 8 years into my career. And I thought, a lot of us thought, and this actually might be like, it's shocking for some people who are more digital natives to hear, but me and my colleagues, or my colleagues and I, we really thought this is going to be great because this is going to democratize the way that we collectively shape consensus about what's going on in the world. And it's going to break down some of these superficial barriers. You know, again, I was a kid who grew up going to like punk and hardcore shows and didn't want to have literal barriers between the fan and the stage. And so I thought, okay, they're taking down some of the guardrails. Let's really have a two-way relationship with readership. And then it very quickly devolved into, oh, people are just going to say like weird, mean, anti-Semitic things about me in comments. And that started very early on, no matter what I was writing about. Wrestling has actually, I think, been a more welcoming space in some ways. There is a tendency, I want to tread lightly, again, not that anyone cares what I have to say one way or the other, but there is a tendency for a lot of wrestling fans, especially, I think there's a pressure, as you said, if you're trying to gamify things so that you have a voice in the wilderness of Twitter, to make yourself appear as if you just always like known, you know, all the history of like All Japan Pro Wrestling, like, you know, it's always at your fingertips, and that goes for me too. Like I definitely pass myself off probably as more of an authority on some things, just from cramming and wanting to be up and current with conversations. But you know, I had one moment where I felt like, you know what, I'm done. Like trying, I'm done. I no longer want to like have these conversations on Twitter about wrestling with people. When I made a comment about Jon Moxley coming out to Wild Thing and saying like it was maybe better as just a one-time thing, and this really going to be the gimmick now, and then people calling me out because I didn't realize it was a tribute to whomever in Japan. And I made the mistake, of course, of being like, oh, excuse me, I didn't know, you know, and oh, you can't just own it, man, you can't just admit you didn't know everything. And I just, you know, I kind of wanted to say, did you really, like, before you had the opportunity to go like YouTube, like Jon Moxley, Wild Thing, influence, you know, and it's just, that just is so, that's where you really get sucked into this absolute just quicksand of meaningless insular banter that doesn't have any like reach outside of its own little echo chamber, and is counterproductive. And so I don't know, I'm just going in circles here, but I don't know if that really addresses you.
So the reason why this relates is because beat writers who are writing about sports now, they almost have to be experts at the X's and O's because there is so much data available to them. The fan doesn't just want to know what you and I knew when we were younger, which is what's the score? What did the coach think about this player? What did the player think about this home run or this, mistake that they made? Now, the way that I see beat writers cover sports, football, basketball, baseball, much more of a heavier analytics insight, much more. Basketball writers are like, oh, here's the strategy. They were going to run a pin down here to get this shooter open, and so that also, it relates to pro wrestling, because if you don't know a specific thing that the fan does know, they're like, well, then why the hell am I even bothering with you? Which is an interesting thing, because should we all have to be experts about everything? Probably not, because we do other things with our lives than just focus on pro wrestling. But I think it definitely relates to other coverage because of the internet today.
Yeah, I think you're right. And because I never intended to pass myself off as someone who was that encyclopedic. My thing is always, just like I never have been someone who really responds to sort of what's going on in gossip in any, my coverage of wrestling has been much more sort of feature in nature. And
sure,
not to look down on, I'm just saying, I feel like, when did I ever suggest that that was my strength? I feel like I've always been very, I've tried to be clear in my writing and in any of my observations that I really just like to kind of zoom out and look at the big picture of what's going on in the world of wrestling in the context of what's going on in the world, period. And if you want to get that granular, then I know the guy for you. And like,
exactly.
That's really what I should have said in that situation was, totally cool. Like mea culpa, but like makes me think you should follow this guy because they're totally steeped in that stuff.
Right. No, the big picture thing is cool because that's another thing about internet culture, which is there is an opportunity to write about this stuff on a mainstream level because you've written for The Ringer, you've written for Rolling Stone, like you've written in other places where historically, if we were back in the media, like when we were growing up, maybe the Rolling Stone had an article about Hulk Hogan and Cyndi Lauper back in 1985, but they're not covering wrestling in the magazine. It's a rock and roll magazine, but because of the internet and because there are different branches of things that you want to hit and bring in readers from different demographics, you can now write about big picture things in an important way. And that hasn't always been the case for wrestling fans. Like I think there was like one Sports Illustrated article when I was growing up that we sort of had to keep to say, look, we matter. Like people care about us.
Right. And then on some level, it's that thing again. I related to like, growing up with the, in sort of a punk rock mindset but we don't really want them to recognize us at the same point, and we like you can acknowledge us, but we're not going to like invite you in,
right, yeah.
But at a certain point I wanted wrestling to be invited in on that conversation, and I wanted people to appreciate that wrestling was just another lens through which to think about everything that is human. and as part of that, we can certainly talk about and initiate people in like what's problematic about the sport, just like there's things problematic in TV and film. And don't look no further than, Harvey Weinstein sitting in a jail cell and we could go on and on. The battle for credibility was a long and winding one. I don't want to get too in the weeds of it, but I will just say that I started covering wrestling professionally as just one part of what I was expected to be doing as a jack of all trades reporter for different publications as early as 20 years ago. But only in the early 2010s, I was knocking down the door with some of my mainstream editors and was really rejected. It's like the story of someone going around with a demo tape and every label rejects them until someone, and then finally one of my editors at Rolling Stone let me do a big feature on Daniel Bryan almost 8 years ago now. And that's what really kicked things off. And then I had a regular column writing about wrestling for Rolling Stone, and WWE was psyched, and so they were giving me good access. And then and then there's different sort of cycles. And now I just sort of like am spoke in the wheel because there's so many, so much different mainstream coverage of wrestling. So it's which is great.
Just say it. You're the 50 Cent of pro wrestling journalism.
No,
passed your demo around. The right people finally listened. Eminem and Dr. Dre were like, okay, we need to take advantage of this.
Well, and I always have to say too that my former colleague, if you can put it that way, I was sort of a freelancer for him, but David Shoemaker at The Ringer, who of course really innovated writing about wrestling for the mainstream in a thoughtful way with Bill Simmons's blessing, for Gremlin back in the day. I don't think that if that didn't happen, I don't think I could have said to my editor, Rolling Stone, like, look, there's a precedent, like a recent precedent for this, you know?
Yeah, no, 100%.
David, I'm giving you your due.
So I definitely want to come back to that. But just for big picture idea, you started covering the AEW thing from the beginning. I remember having a conversation with Dave Meltzer like way before I think anybody had ever mentioned AEW, where he asked me about Tony Khan, and I was like, Tony Khan. I know Shad Khan. I know Shahid Khan from Jacksonville, but I don't know Tony Khan. And he's like, okay. So that, like, I remember that conversation months and months and months before we had heard of what AEW was. You were covering it from the beginning. You see what they've done now. You know, we're 2 years and change into the show, or into the company, and then also Dynamite. What do you, how do you see their place in history already in this ability to take a startup company and to just run so freaking hard and fast to the point of today? They are competing with Monday Night Raw in the 18, we have to say the 18 to 49 demographic. Like that's the key here. But it just amazes me that it happened so quickly. They were able to, and we've heard this before, right? Like the idea has always been, what wrestling company is going to find this old fan who stopped watching and who may not exist anymore? And I don't think that's what AEW did. I think what AEW did was it found the people who were still watching WWE, but who just were not super happy with WWE. Right. And they were like, come watch us. And now they're the loyal fan. But like, we've seen it with TNA and all these other startup, wrestling companies who kind of get going. And then, some of them don't even get out of the gate. Like, all of a sudden, you hear about them and then they just die. But this is pretty unprecedented as far as I can tell. And it almost seems like we blinked and all of a sudden they're competing with Monday Night Raw for viewers.
Yeah. I think it's funny. I think there's two sides to the coin. I think for the typical wrestling fan, it's really, really exciting to see people be empowered to wrestle where they want to wrestle and have an opportunity to kind of, reintroduce themselves. And WWE ultimately has enough, time and talent to go around, and so they can afford to shed some of this extra personnel. And so it almost seems like no harm, no foul. But on the other side, there is, as much as I think other, let's say, mid-sized promotions or smaller than that, who sort of put on, postured the right way about how they were rooting for AEW in the beginning and maybe still present things that way. It's challenging when AEW can just kind of make it more enticing for the Brian Pillmans and MJFs of the world to have a home there, because they can offer a sort of rocket ship that that a Court Bauer at MLW just has to make happen on a very different timetable.
Right.
And then you think about, okay, is that good for the people who are only able to really access wrestling by going to these smaller, more affordable shows in more sort of far-flung locations, or where it just feels more accessible? And where they want to see things, there are people who like to just go see minor league baseball, so that's one thing. And I think another thing is that AEW absolutely is conscious of the fact that they owe a debt to the Impacts, TNAs, Ring of Honors, et cetera, of the world. And that, that was their sort of precedent to say, okay, if we took that all as an aggregate, but really had a vision and really had the resources and really had the right partners, what can we do? And I think by paying it backward to, and opening the forbidden door with some of those companies, that's been an acknowledgement of that. And certainly, the homage to, New Japan and that sort of acknowledgement, I think, gives them a lot of good currency in the business and among people who really consider themselves, purists and pure fans. So What was I? Where was I going with that? I think okay. I'll fast forward and say, and I said this to someone recently. When Daniel Bryan debuted / Bryan Danielson debuted for AEW, it was at that point coming out after CM Punk and so many others. It almost was overwhelming. It felt like something had just, the dam had burst. And it really was a new era. And it's great because to me, WWE still serves its purpose. It's relatively family accessible entertainment on a massive global scale, and AEW gives fans who weren't alive like we were coming of age with ECW and more of the hardcore revolution to finally feel like they're a part of something like that from the beginning. Again, I can't help but think of more other subcultural movements, and that's the irony, is this thing is funded by this billionaire scion, but it feels, and it's in partnership with a major network and everything else, but it feels somehow like just the beginning of a movement.
So I love your comparison to Punk, Punk music, not CM Punk, because I made the same analogy on another show that I did, but I also think, you know, I'm a big hip hop fan, and I don't think hip hop exists without punk rock as well. At some point, though, AEW has kind of crossed over by taking so much WWE talent that if that continues to be the game and you continue bringing in bigger stars, or who else is out there left, it sort of changes in it, and it sort of becomes a little bit more pop music. And I wonder if there is any hesitation for the fans. I don't think so yet. I don't see it yet. I don't see any disenfranchised fans who are like, oh man, like, you know, when you know, Joey Janela, I thought he was going to be like the main event star on this show, and I don't see him anymore. I don't sense it's that, but I do wonder. I'm starting to hear a little bit about, well, what about Sammy Guevara, or, you know, what about Max Caster, and guys who looked like they were on the ascent. But then you have to put a little bit of a pause on them, because when you bring a Daniel Bryan in, when you bring a CM Punk in, when you bring a Malachi Black in, there's rumors that, you know, that the former Bray Wyatt may also come in. Some of that younger talent who you sort of enjoy watching from the beginning because you get to see their entire journey, they're going to have to wait a little bit. What do you think there's any, I guess the question is more so, do you sense that moving too fast with this stuff could be harmful at some point?
For sure. I mean, look, you could take the cautionary tale of what happened with WCW in the Hogan onward through, you know, NWO era. But the difference there is, you know, I don't think the inmates are running the asylum here.
Sure.
I think there's, if anything, Tony has really bore down in presenting himself, I think, internally within the company and externally to observers as the guy who's in charge, as opposed to this idea that there was this collective of the elite making the decisions behind the scenes. And, you know, it's very, in press releases even now for AEW, they're very emphatic that Tony is the founder and CEO and, you know, all this kind of stuff.
And he himself is actually in the media more going like, I've taken way more control of this thing than I have in the past. And I think that's the improvement. Like, he's saying, I have more responsibility now, which is why the product is better. Part of the reason why the product is better. Yeah.
He said, I've interviewed Tony a couple of times, and the most recent time he did say something to that effect. And I'm sure he's repeated it, you know, in other interviews. He's out there in the media plenty. You know, backlash is inevitable. You and I are old enough to have seen it, you know, in every facet of the culture. He's, you know, and in life, whether it's politics or anything else, life, politics, art, there's going to be a groundswell of concerns and critical feedback. And hopefully they're paying attention to that and they make adjustments. But at the same point, they can only adjust so much because they're also paying attention to, you know, what their analytics tells them and what their real-time data tells them. And it's really interesting. I'm intending on doing a big feature on someone soon for a big outlet. I'm being vague only because I'm just first talking with the company about it, like the wrestling company that is about it. But when you talk about some of the stars that have managed to separate themselves from, say, the Joey Janela's or the Sonny Kisses or everyone who got that time in the beginning with AEW, but now has maybe established themselves as more of a mainstay, is it because they did something in the parlance of McMahon parlance and brass rings, did something to really go and seize the moment? Or is it because there was just that instant feedback, all those measurables about what the value was of that person and what the what the deliverables were for that person and how they could be monetized? And so I the calculus of all that is heady, and it's new to this era of wrestling. And I think that's going to be as much what determines what wrestling looks like in the coming future, than as much as the fans want to think, than their sort of they're kind of petitioning for what they want online, or by chanting enough in person, or even compared to the way the sheer force of will some of the talent move the needle in certain directions 20 years ago.
As a fan, not as a journalist, not as a professional, what is your current relationship with WWE?
As a fan.
Right.
I still watch it. I still watch Raw. I still watch SmackDown. I've checked out of NXT even before the makeover. Everyone has different bandwidth. I'm a father of 2 children. I have 100%. A full-time job. Yeah. 100%. So, my wife occasionally, wants to spend time with me. I don't know. So I just have to triage, yes. And I like it. To me, it's more important to make sure that I'm actually current with like Ring of Honor TV and MLW TV than it necessarily is to feel like I'm covering all my bases with WWE just so I can be like in on what's trending on Twitter of that day, or be able to talk on a podcast about, what just happened on NXT last week. So yeah, I still enjoy the flagship shows. I still watch the pay-per-views. I take them at face value. I do like to overanalyze them. I think that's part of the sport of it. And I'm just fascinated by the machinations of this company and the possibility of there being a succession plan now, looming. And it's fascinating as a business, and it's still absurd and carnival-like and entertaining as a product. So I know that's going to sound like I'm out of touch and whatever, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of in vogue to really dismiss what WWE is doing for a lot of fans. I always, I mean, maybe creatively they're probably not, even half of what their best timing, their best era was, but I do think they do a lot of things very well. But the one thing, if you don't have that relationship with your fans, and you sort of take them for granted, which I think they've done a lot, I could see why certain fans react that way, which is why the fan service in AEW is a pretty big thing, because I think they saw like there's a gap in giving fans what they want, whereas WWE is all about taking away what the fans want so they can get them frustrated, and keep coming back to see if they'll ever get it. Mm-hmm. But the setup to that was, I'm assuming that you became a fan of wrestling because of WWF at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean, it might have even been WWF. Were in it, but yeah, like you said, I'm of a certain vintage. I'm 42, so I was, roughly kindergarten age in the like peak of Hulkamania. I mean, I don't know when you want to say the peak of Hulkamania was, but to me, the initial like crest of Hulkamania around the original WrestleMania. So yeah, there was no other. I did like you. I came of age at a time where the territories had already been kind of consolidated.
Yes,
and I had to kind of reverse engineer by learning about wrestling, and it wasn't long before I was not even seeking out, but just like seeing, like weird used VHSs of like Mid-South Wrestling at Video Lady video store, and just wanted to know more. And there was never, I couldn't ever know enough. WWF was the seed, but it quickly grew in different directions.
It's so funny because when if you were a fan from that era, what WWF was trying to do was basically tell you that this is the only game in town, and it's the only game that's ever been in town, and anything before what you're currently watching doesn't really matter that much. Because I remember growing up and just being a Hogan guy and then just being so amazed that he was a bad guy before. Like, I was like, oh, this thing happened before I was born, and there's a history to it. Whereas like baseball wants you to celebrate the history at every single possible moment you can. And wrestling was like, there is no history. Like, what you're watching is current, and that's all that matters. So it was a mind thing for me when I figured out that there was actually other companies, and that there was a history, and that there was, WWF before Hulk Hogan, because that's just not what they wanted you to really think about or get into. They just wanted you to focus on what the present was.
Yeah, it was revisionist, right? What's the Philip Roth novel, or right? But The Man in the High Castle, was that Philip Roth? Am I making that up?
You got me.
Not Philip K. Dick, Philip Roth. Very different authors. In any event, it's funny though, because that, AEW is still taking a page from that playbook, because everything relies on this cognitive dissonance, in wrestling. Sure, we all know about who these wrestlers were when they were in WWE, and we even can sort of tease that and play with that in little elliptical ways. If you're like on commentary for AEW, or you're in any way commenting on it on the show online. But still,
CM Punk's strategy with his first interview was almost to say, when I left ROH to now, I didn't even consider that to be what this is. Like, his entire WWE run, he tried to like sweep it under the rug as, that's not what I'm doing now, which is pro wrestling.
Yeah, right. And he's his story is interesting, and one I'd love to revisit him. 6 years after I did a story on him when he was transitioning to MMA, but at the same point, he's a little bit aloof anyway. So
he's Happy Punk right now, though, so you might be able to get some good quotes from him.
He's Happy Punk, which I give them the benefit of the doubt, or I should actually give them credit. I expected them to kind of, blow that load early and turn him heel right away, and they're going to really just make it, just ingratiate him to the point where it's unbearable when he finally, shows his true colors. But I guess what I was trying to say before is, I'm not sure if this even ties together anymore, is that we still have to be able to say to ourselves as wrestling fans, we know Bryan Danielson was Daniel Bryan for the last 11 years, but we just accept now that he's Bryan Danielson.
Yes.
And we're gonna act like we're all in on it, because we all sort of like know what it means when Tony Schiavone makes some weird little Easter eggy comment about something like that. That's
you said you're not watching NXT.
No.
You would get such a kick out of Rick Steiner's son, who they were originally going to call Rex Steiner, which is maybe the greatest professional wrestling name in the history. And then they changed it to Braun Breaker, which doesn't fit him at all. And nobody will mention the name Steiner. Nobody will mention the fact that he is the son of a former pro wrestler and the nephew of a former famous pro wrestler. But they will throw in certain lines like Dogface Gremlin. They call his submission hold the recliner, but they don't put the Steiner. So it's going on strong with young Bronson Rex Steiner here in NXT.
I heard about that and saw some of the memes, and I think that's a different case where they're almost insulting the audience's intelligence, as opposed to where AEW is almost kind of like pandering to their intelligence.
Sure.
I'm not sure that I care for either approach, but such is the nature of wrestling right now. Maybe this is like a little bit of an aside, but I have to say, having been at that show the other night, the one thing that really resonated with me was Malachi Black in particular, where it was a bit of a rough start when they on commentary, they kind of bungled his introduction and all that. But since then, and now culminating in that show on Wednesday, I thought there's a guy where WWE, while they do what they do so well, they really were in over their heads with the presentation of a character like that.
Sure.
And this is where he needs to be. And they really, that is a perfect case study of, here's a guy where the gloves are off. He's given creative control over what he wants to do, even down to, having a black metal band that he likes as his entrance music. And it felt real. It didn't feel cartoonish the way that some of these more kind of occulty characters have tended to be in the reality era of wrestling. So I just wanted to mention that.
No. It's a great point. Okay. Wrapping this thing up, I could probably talk to you for many hours, and maybe we'll have to do this again. But I want to come back to the idea of covering pro wrestling at this big picture scale. The Ringer, Bill Simmons, they're doing big things with podcasts, with the website. So as a Bill Simmons fan, from the beginning, really, like I was following him as soon as I could on ESPN's old Page 2.
Me too.
Like just that experience, like being able to do that at that website, and then talk about it on a podcast, which, I don't know what the scale of the listenership was, but a big giant network. Like, what was that like? Because I know you're not really doing stuff with them at this point. Not to say that you won't in the future, but that's how I really recognized your name. Was like, oh yeah, I seen him on the Ringer. I've seen him do the stuff with the Masked Man on the podcast. So just quickly, how was that and doing that stuff at the Ringer?
That was blessed. That was, a 2-year run that, like you said, it's not like it, the door is shut. It's just with all the things going on behind the scenes there, where they sold themselves to Spotify, and there were all these different movements going on with the podcast. And I think they have some relationship now with WWE. I never had any expectations of whether or not I would have any sort of role in that. I was always a freelance, albeit regular freelance contributor, for that couple of year period of time. I think the last couple of major things I wrote for them were a big blowout on Tessa Blanchard, which turned out to be more of a bit of a hex for her. And
that thing comes up very early in search results for you. Yes.
Yeah. Probably because it published not long before there were accusations about her behavior in the locker room and things that didn't emerge in my reporting, which I really wasn't looking for it. And
sure.
New information. Anyway, the point is, it was a really, heady thing. And, I've been grinding away, doing a lot of columns for Rolling Stone on wrestling for a few years. But suddenly when the Ringer happened, I think because so many wrestling fans followed Simmons and Shoemaker there and just skipped over the fact that like Rolling Stone was even covering wrestling.
Sure.
Immediately there was this thing of like, this guy Kenny Herzog is doing these columns for Ringer now. And I was very happy to have that conversation with wrestling fans, for those couple of years, with columns I would do as a jumping off point. And that's why it was fun. It was fun to be part of that community and that conversation. And that's why I still itch. It's difficult. I have this full-time job unrelated to anything wrestling, although I've squeaked in a lot of wrestling features for it, like Good Brothers and Court Bauer, just because they're like business people and it's a business publication. And I have some other things happening extracurricular wise, but I still ache to do more big features like the one that I alluded to before that is in the planning stages with one of my big outlets, because it's an excuse then for me to eventually be talking about wrestling in a really animated way for a little while with some folks, because I just helped spark a discussion. So that's how I'd summarize that experience at the Ringer. It was very much like all of a sudden just being part of a fan club,
So I promise this is the last question. I know we both got to get back to our day job stuff, but this is what's interesting. And I like talking to journalists. I like talking to content creators because there is a mindset from folks who do this stuff, or who write, who publish, that I'm fascinated by. And so this question is more along the lines of, you just mentioned you're a freelance guy and you're writing at all these different places. There has been a pivot towards people creating small sort of media companies based off of their name, whether it came from ESPN or whether they got their fame from working at a bigger media company, and they sort of pivoted to like a smaller media company. So, for instance, Colin Cowherd has his own podcast network. Right. There's the Meadowlark, I think is another one pivoted off of folks from ESPN. As somebody who understands sort of the business aspect of the media, the media business, has there ever been a wanting for you to kind of build something like that, or to be involved in building something like that kind of from the ground up? Like, have you ever thought about doing that? Have you ever been approached to do something like that? Just based off of, your history of what you've done in the past?
Yeah. Memories are short. I accept that, I've definitely been lapped, over the last couple of years by some folks who are really enterprising in that space. And that's, a few of them were definitely in the media seats near me at Dynamite the other day. And they're all very, driven with what they do, So I think I don't know that I've never been a great sort of networker. I've never been, I don't know how to put it. Yeah. Okay. On some level, of course, you have your Twitter following and you try and, like I did, start a podcast, with MLW Radio and do these things and have columns so that you can have your own sort of brand and personality in this space. But you can't force it. And I've never been one to like have the initiative to do Substacks or Patreons, which, hey man, Godspeed to you. And
it's hard. It's hard work. It's slow in the beginning, and to do it, you got to just do it because you love it, not necessarily because you know what the outcome is going to be. So it's definitely something that you need the time and sort of the I guess passion is the wrong word, but you just need to do it because you want to put people on who maybe never have been heard before. But I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm the kind of person who maybe admittedly sometimes more needs like a mentor or a benefactor or someone to kind of just open up these possibilities for me, because I sometimes don't always know how to find them myself. But I hope, hey, in my own small way, I feel like I've contributed something to the collected annals of wrestling commentary just in this last decade. And I've, like I said, I've, been in some way, shape or form covering wrestling professionally, when at every opportunity I could for 2 decades, which is nothing compared to the Meltzers of the world. But it's so thrilling for me as a lifelong wrestling fan to have on some level made it my mission to be heard and for people to hear more about what it is about wrestling that I love. So, all good.
All right. So like I mentioned, I knew you from your stuff at the Ringer, also the Rolling Stone. I also heard you, one of my good friends, BJ Cruz, works at Vover, and I know you've done the little short podcasts with him on Vover. But where else can people find you?
Oh, sure. I mean, look, I think if you just search for me and in combination with just wrestling and some of the outlets I've done big features for over the years, whether it's the ones you mentioned, but also like Bleacher Report and Vulture and Slate and even Tablet magazine, where I did a big feature, about anti-Semitic tropes in wrestling. It's all over the place. And I have, Bleacher Report is still a place where I have a good relationship, and it's a place where I'm working on getting something going right now, and where I did a nice blowout on MVP earlier in the year, for them. So I'm trying to still make stuff happen where I can. I'm grateful to have this conversation because, as I alluded to, I just haven't been able to find the opportunity to carry on with my own podcast and
Sure.
the heavy lift of that.
It's a lot of work.
That's
so much work.
Why I appreciate and respect, that you're doing this and you have so many other things going on in terms of your personal and professional life. So, but that's a, and I'm always rambling about wrestling on Twitter. Always rambling about wrestling on Twitter at Kenny Herzog. So join the party,
Hey man, I really appreciate you coming on. I know we were trying to do this earlier and things got in the way, but we made it work. Really appreciate it, and I was just so happy to talk to you.
No, me too. Thanks for hanging with me, Garrett.
All right, so for Kenny Herzog, thanks to him for coming on. I'm Double G. We'll see you when we see you. Peace out.